Memories and deeply held thoughts. For 14 years, 1962 to 1976, I was active in foreign relations for the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, NLF/Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG. As I look across my life, those years comprise the period most worthy of note, for they cover some of our country's major events, which I witnessed and in which I had the very good fortune to participate. I will always hold dear the deep impressions and many priceless lessons from that time. I can say that our leaders gave deep thought to Vietnam's political policies and provided careful direction during the Paris Conference in particular and during our struggle in general. First, I want to mention the guideline to establish the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam on December 20th, 1960. This wise policy was both strategic and tactical. Through that step, we created a united national front involving all social strata. We included not only the patriotic forces of the NLF with lawyer Nguyen Thi Binh, a major Southern intellectual, as president, but also the National Alliance for Democracy and Peace led by lawyer Trinh Dinh Thao, another famous Southern intellectual, as well as two large groups, the people who really were the third force and the patriotic overseas Vietnamese. In addition to that guideline, we took advantage of the prestige of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRVN, the Socialist North, and in particular, the great prestige and respect accorded to the DRVN leader, Phê Đen Ho Chí Minh. This allowed us to leverage widespread support and solidarity with worldwide forces working for peace, independence, freedom, and justice. We can say that voices from everywhere, from large cities to remote villages, including even those close to the North Pole, announced solidarity with Vietnam. Everyone agrees today that the international solidarity movement with Vietnam, which formed in opposition to the American War of Aggression, was the largest and longest such movement in world history. That worldwide movement of people who cherish peace was extremely important in contributing to Vietnam's eventual victory. To understand the NLF's value and significance, we must look at the circumstances that led to its establishment. The period from 1956 until 1959 was a terribly bleak time in the South. The USDM regime instituted merciless repression of the Southern peace movement, which was demanding implementation of the 1954 Geneva Agreement. Then the USDM regime organized a campaign to denounce and eradicate communists, including everyone from the old resistance movement against France, as well as anyone who opposed the Saigon regime. To do this, the regime's police hauled guillotines into villages throughout the South. Prisons sprouted up everywhere. They were brimming with people, old and young, men and women. Tens of thousands of people in the countryside were held in colossal camps called strategic hamlets. Many international journalists concluded the South is one giant prison. For a long time, activists in the South followed the party's directive to resist through peaceful demonstrations and reconciliation, but the enemy pushed us to the end of our patience, armed to the teeth. The enemy terrorized and executed our people en masse, yet we had only our empty hands. We could not stand silently with our arms folded while the enemy waged its one-sided war. Our people asked to take up arms. The party heard our people's mournful pleas and, just in time, changed the guidelines for our resistance. Movement. In 1959, the party implemented its historic Decision 15, which accelerated the political struggle and simultaneously expedited military action, thereby opening the route through which the people of the South could achieve victory. Decision 15 was a turning point in our nation's modern history and particularly in our struggle against the United States. Like a flood breaking a dike, our people in many localities responded to the party's new guidelines with uprisings. In the midst of this ebullience, the party guided the formation of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam to unite the various strata of Southerners in struggle against the United States. The goal was our country's independence and reunification. In this special context, the NLF served not only as a political organization uniting all people in political and armed struggle, but also as a de facto political administration. From 1960 until 1969, the Front established committees at various levels to lead our people in political, military, economic, cultural, and diplomatic affairs. Another political victory worthy of note is the formation of the alliance of National, Democratic, and Peace Forces of Vietnam with lawyer Trinh Dinh Thao, a great intellectual in the South, as president. The alliance, which was established on April 20th, 1968, a few months after the Tet 1968 offensive, included many patriots, intellectuals, and religious leaders, whose views were patriotic and whose members were organizing more openly in the cities. With this step, our front opposing the United States to save the nation expanded. When describing the Vietnamese struggle, especially during the resistance against France and the resistance against the United States, we should remember that most of the major Vietnamese intellectuals participated alongside the farmers and the workers. Similarly, when describing the international movement united with Vietnam, we should remember that many key intellectuals in other nations were also active participants. Everyone who was of sufficient age at that time remembers the Bertrand Russell Tribunal established by Bertrand Russell, the famous British philosopher-mathematician. Participants included other famous intellectuals, such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Laurent Schwartz. We know that, most of all, intellectuals understand the value of the individual, and they understand the meaning of freedom and justice. The 1968 Tet General Offensive burst forth 8 years after the front's founding and reverberated across the South. This event was a core victory and another key turning point in the Vietnamese People's Revolutionary War. 11 years later, in September 1979, the IVH Congress of the Communist Party affirmed, "Only with the spring of 1968 could we have had the spring of 1975. Up until now, a number of authors who were American officials, particularly in the military, have held that the Viet Cong suffered a heavy defeat during the Tet Offensive of 1968, the year of the monkey. They have also believed that, had the Americans plunged headlong by using their full military strength, the United States probably would have achieved victory. These are the shallow and blind views of those who saw apparent facts, but not the essence of the issue. They saw the temporal unfold before their eyes, but they did not see the whole. Therefore, they could neither perceive nor foresee the underlying, inevitable, and ultimate conclusion. Our losses during the Tet General Offensive were certainly not small, but that heroic offensive did shake the aggressive will of the United States. Previously, our Liberation Army had achieved only small victories in rural areas. However, with the Tet Offensive, our troops struck in unison across the South and achieved victories inside the capital and at the enemy's headquarters. The meaning was clear: in no place could the enemy be secure. The 1968 Tet Offensive forced the United States to reach a very important decision: the need to search for a way to de-escalate the war. It compelled the Johnson administration to enter into negotiations, even though the United States held tenaciously to the goal of finding a solution from a position of strength. For years, We in the South had been struggling against U.S. escalation of the war. On June 26, 1954, 3 weeks before the signing of the Geneva Agreement, the United States brought Nguyen Thi Binh from New York to Saigon to serve as Prime Minister of the Republic of Vietnam. Nguyen Thi Binh had spent the previous 3 years outside New York City in a Catholic seminary. On January 20th, 1960, President Kennedy decided to use Vietnam as a site for special war. On May 11th, 1961, the United States sent to Vietnam 400 Special Forces soldiers and 100 advisors to set up strategic hamlets, which incarcerated millions of Vietnamese. Then, in December, the number of advisors increased to 3,200. Yet the special war failed. In August 1964, the Johnson administration staged the Tonkin Gulf incident in order to expand the war. On March 8, 1965, 2,500 U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang and Chu Lai, beginning the localized war. On July 30, 1965, the United States sent masses of troops to increase its forces for localized war. By the end of 1967, the number of U.S. and Allied troops, excluding the Saigon Army, ERVN, had reached 600,000. Indeed, by the time the Paris Conference began in 1968, we in the South were facing an occupying U.S. Army. Our guideline for the four-party conference in Paris was to fight through negotiations, thereby opening the struggle's new diplomatic front to increase our strength in battle. This policy was both correct and wise. During the 5 years of the four-party conference, we in the South increased our military strength through assistance from the North. We on the political and diplomatic fronts took advantage of widespread international world opinion to weaken the enemy's rearguard. We can view the Paris negotiating table as a new, effective battlefield with continuing offensives first from the NLF and then from the PRG, beginning with the 10 points, then the 8 points, then the 7 points, and finally the 2 points. These successive proposals increasingly cornered the enemy. In particular, we can view the 7-point plan, which we presented in July 1971, as our diplomatic equivalent to the 1968 Tet Offensive. We concentrated on our demand that the United States remove all its military forces from South Vietnam. We set aside our desire for an immediate political solution in the South. This final blow forced the United States to follow the direction of eventually accepting the draft Paris Agreement, which Vietnam had presented. After the signing of the Paris Agreement in late January 1973, our leaders predicted that 2 outcomes were possible in early 1973. In the first case, the Saigon administration would continue the war with U.S. support and assistance. In the second case, the situation between the Saigon administration and the PRG with a third force would become very complicated and turn into a morass. But in the end, we would surely achieve victory. Not long after the actual signing, we saw that the first possibility was more likely and that the balance of forces increasingly favored us. In 1975, the party decided that we must strike quickly, defeat the puppet troops, and liberate the South. This was a correct and timely policy. Thus, our troops and supportive civilians launched the 1975 Spring General Offensive, bringing total victory. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. We can draw important lessons from our resistance war against the United States and from our struggle to assure the nation's independence and sovereignty. I think particularly about these major strategic guidelines. We knew how to coordinate our national strength, using the power of timing. With that overall guideline, we relied on political advantages and resources from the Soviet Union, China, and the Socialist Bloc at the same time that we took advantage of worldwide sympathy and the call for justice. The result was multiplied strength. Here, I feel I must record accurately the NLF's important contribution through its flexible policy combined with wise, dynamic action. Using this approach, we elicited sympathy and won over people with differing political views, thereby creating a strong, widespread international movement of support. In addition, we always followed our own principles of independence and self-reliance on the battlefield and in the negotiations. We took advantage of our friends' advice, yet we always made our own decisions to ensure our own national interest. We had a great need in the southern battlefield for weapons during this cruel stage of the war. Yet the transport distance from the north along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to the south was long and fraught with difficulties. Some countries allied with us suggested they send personnel to drive vehicles and weapons to the south. Our Vietnamese leaders expressed their thanks but refused these offers. We asked to receive the weapons, but the transport and use of those weapons was our work and our responsibility. We refused to allow the war to spread into an international conflict, for this would have been complicated and would have caused us to lose the initiative. Equally, we refused to allow the ongoing division of our country. The 1954 Geneva Conference had brought us many valuable insights. We were determined to fight, and we knew how to fight. We knew how to begin a war, and we knew how to conclude a war. Now, after nearly 40 years, many political activists across the world still claim to have been completely surprised at the victory of the people of Vietnam, such a small country, which dared to fight against the world's largest imperialist power. To understand the sources of this heroic outcome, we must remember Vietnam's recorded history of 2,000 years, during which our ancestors established and defended our nation. It is imperative to research the materials, signed documents, and summaries, probably incomplete, of the comrades who were the historical participants. Many other comrades, and I usually make this additional point. President Ho Chi Minh was the father and soul of our country and of our people's formidable resistance war against the United States. The party's directives followed Ho Chi Minh's substantive ideology regarding domestic and international unity. Alongside President Ho, the Politburo led by Comrade Le Duan was the supreme political command, as well as the general tactical headquarters for steering the country during the war's dangerous and decisive stages. I remember 1956 and 1957 when the enemy launched its White Terror in the South. Many people were very worried and did not understand what might come with future struggle in the South. At that time, Comrade Le Duan declared, "It's not that the enemy is strong. Instead, the enemy is weakening. He must resort to savage means in order to crush the masses." Reality has decisively proven this lucid, sharp-witted point. For the enemy's savage, White Terror increased the Southerners' anger and desire for action. Based on this understanding and the design for the Southern Revolution, in 1959, the party instituted its historic Decision 15. The letter Comrade Le Duan sent to Comrade Pham Hung in 1975 regarding the major points of a Politburo meeting allows us to understand more clearly the Politburo's purpose, intelligence, skill, and spirit in guiding the conclusion of the war, which had lasted nearly 30 years when counting from 1945. During these last decisive moments, Comrade Le Duan's directive was perceptive and precise. This is the most favorable opportunity. No other opportunity will be comparable. If we wait another 10 or 15 years, the situation will become complicated, endlessly complicated. We must work fast, completely, and thoroughly but wisely and skillfully. I think we should continue to remember the huge contribution of Comrade Le Duan. However, to cover the whole effort requires speaking of all the contributions from all the leaders of the Workers' Party, now the Vietnamese Communist Party, for they were very close to our people. Today, the international communist movement is in a period of setbacks. However, we Vietnamese certainly could not have liberated our country without the sound and skilled leadership of the party. Even though the contributions of senior party leaders were significant, it is essential to remember the millions of party members and the brave masses of people who followed the party and protected the party. They fought with all their strength and courage, and they were indomitable. Tens of thousands, even millions of people from one generation to the next lost their lives for our nation's sacred cause while fighting under the party's flag. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. During the War of Resistance against the United States, I was assigned to work in foreign relations, in addition to taking part in the Paris Conference. My other primary work was mobilizing international support for our resistance movement. Perhaps I can say that the chance to meet people everywhere helped me gain important understandings. We have often spoken of the great support we receive from people in countries across the world. To be fair, I must also speak about the important role of governments. Many Western countries had special interest relationships and could not support us. Some even followed the United States in opposing Vietnam. At the same time, other countries, especially Sweden, were completely different. Those countries, from their people to their governments, became close and tireless friends of Vietnam. From the beginning, the Swedish government publicized and opposed the U.S. policy of aggression against Vietnam and was faithful to the end. We often speak about the Swedish people, the major political and cultural Swedish leaders, and the details of their closeness to Vietnam. In Sweden, people say there was the Vietnam generation, and that Vietnam entered their lives. Large numbers of Swedish youth, as well as youth in many other countries, became political converts to our people's struggle. Vietnam brought them a fresh reason to live. I think the strength of what is right and just per se conquered their hearts. Sweden, like other countries of Northern Europe, is a cousin of the United States. But the Swedes could not accept the Americans' cruel actions. Many Americans who refused to fight left the United States and received asylum in Sweden. The Bertrand Russell Tribunal and many other international meetings in support of Vietnam occurred there. The Swedes were empathetic, and their voluntary actions were evidence of a truly civilized country with a deep tradition of compassion. Yet in addition to the pacific attitudes of the Swedish public, we must also speak of the role and actions of the Swedish government and of the nation's leaders, in particular Premier Olof Palme. I want to speak clearly about this because many people in our country do not yet know about the tremendously helpful role Sweden played during our time of need. I had occasion to visit nearly all the socialist countries, from the Soviet Union and China to the countries of Eastern Europe and Cuba. These days, the socialist bloc no longer remains. The Soviet Union has disbanded, and many other countries have changed their orientation or have become more complicated. However, we must nevertheless say that the support and closeness of the governments in the socialist countries during our resistance war against the United States were hugely significant. In particular, the Soviet Union and China were the stable support for the Vietnamese front lines. Of course, varieties of national interest motivated each of the countries that offered assistance. Nevertheless, their support was extremely important. We all know Soviet and Chinese aid came in stages, and we know there were serious conflicts between the two nations. However, Uncle Ho and the party offered sincerity, seriousness, care, and perhaps we can even say great skill to find a clear, flexible path to secure support from these important older sibling countries and from other socialist nations as well. Political activists from other countries have described this as implementation of traditional Vietnamese political wisdom. While I was traveling overseas as a representative for the NFL, I had an opportunity to attend an international conference in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. Here was an unusual nation, where the people venerated their leader and where the leader's words were orders for the populace. North Korea shared with us the plight of a nation divided because of an earlier American-led war. As such, North Korea was a dedicated supporter of Vietnam's struggle to oppose the United States and one of the first countries to recognize the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. Several comrades in our delegation and I went to Hungary many times to work or to rest at Balaton Lake, a famous resort. Everyone we met in Hungary, from the senior-level leaders to ordinary people, supported Vietnam, but particularly Foreign Minister Janos Peter. He would say to me, "Whatever you Vietnamese friends need, we're ready to help." In addition, many Vietnamese comrades and I went to visit the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. At that time, Germany was divided into two countries. Comrades in East Germany, from the party leaders and the government to the mass organizations, all felt strong connections to Vietnam and were zealously supportive in spirit and through shipments of material goods. Many Vietnamese cadres, including those wounded on the battlefield in the south, were brought first to the north and then traveled to East Germany for medical treatment by excellent doctors. At that time, the authorities in West Germany did not support our people's struggle. Nevertheless, the solidarity movement with Vietnam in West Germany was dynamic. Madame Weber, a textile engineer, organized aid to Vietnam. Through her efforts, many patriotic intellectuals and important social activists in West Germany came to understand the Vietnamese people's struggle. They helped us with medical equipment and medicines. This assistance continued after the liberation of the South. Madame Weber's empathy with Vietnam was very deep. In her last will and testament, she stated her wish that Vietnam be her permanent resting place, for that was where her heart had been. This gesture moved us deeply. We implemented her wish. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Paris conference gave me the opportunity to live in France for many years and observe French society. I met many French intellectuals, communist laborers, and progressives. They were upstanding, straightforward, and ready to support people facing difficulties and oppression, even though their own lives were not always easy. I came to understand more about French history and the glorious French cultural heritage of such great thinkers and writers as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Victor Hugo, and others. In addition, we were near the heart of the 1789 Democratic Proletarian Revolution, the Paris Commune, and the motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Indeed, the French people have a democratic tradition. I witnessed many demonstrations as well as workers' and student strikes. I also came to understand in part capitalist consumer society. If a person had a job, he could borrow money from a bank to buy a house and pay off the loan every month at ordinary interest rates. However, if he lost his job and had no money to pay the bank, then the bank would take back the house and he would be out on the street. During the negotiations in France, the DRVN and NLFPRG delegations received wholehearted assistance from the French Communist Party and the overseas Vietnamese community. We will always remember the images of our French security guards and drivers, whom the French Communist Party assigned to help us. They worked with complete dedication for years. So many Vietnamese living in France set aside their own work to come to our houses to make repairs and assist our delegations whenever we had need. We had special friends and comrades who were very close to us. They stood alongside us throughout the long march of 2 wars of resistance, first against France and then against the United States. Even now, they stand with us in our struggle to build and develop our country. Our people will always remember Henri Martin and Raymond Dain, the husband and wife who opposed French colonialism's reinvasion of Vietnam and were imprisoned and suffered many other losses. Another especially close friend is Madeleine Riffaud, a hero during the French resistance against the German Nazis. She supported Vietnam's struggle to secure independence. We know she sacrificed her individual happiness to help our struggle. These days, although she is elderly, frail, and blind, she still follows the situation in Vietnam. Her meetings with Vietnamese friends, including Ben, are her happiest moments. She will talk continuously for hours, forgetting illness and pain. Many overseas Vietnamese intellectuals in France made huge contributions to our 2 delegations in Paris. Pes in cơ huỳnh Trung Đông, Lâm Bá Châu, Pham Ngoc Tới, and Dr. Phan. The list goes on. After liberation, Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter returned to Vietnam and served as Chief Justice in the Ho Chi Minh City Court. Dr. Nguyen Ngoc Ha and Professor Nguyen Ngoc Tran also returned home and participated in the National Assembly. And there were others. Some had to remain in France because of family circumstances. These include Brother Tran Hue Engip, who made many personal sacrifices for our shared work. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I also had the chance to visit many Asian countries in addition to Socialist China. India made a deep impression on me. Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam enjoyed considerable prestige in India, particularly in Calcutta/Kolkata and Bengal, where the Communist Party was influential. Indians felt a special empathy with the Vietnamese struggle. However, while there, I witnessed the stark separation between rich and poor. A provincial governor would have a beautiful palace surrounded by a park with prancing deer. But not far away were people who were desperately poor and living on the streets. I wondered, why do they have this situation? Is it the drawn-out legacy of the caste system? Is it religion? Political trends? Negative consequences from nearly a century of British domination? India has an ancient and glorious culture. Today, Indians rank among the world's greatest experts in many fields. It's unusual, but they have 2 communist parties. It seems to me that if the Indians unify their people even more strongly and take full advantage of the potential of their citizenry and their natural resources, they will create a major political and economic power. During the war, people from the NLF could not secure visas to Japan. At that time, the Japanese government stood alongside the United States, which had many military bases in Japan. The largest of these was Okinawa, from which U.S. airplanes left every day to bomb Vietnam. However, we knew that Japan had a citizens' movement in strong support of our struggle. The progressive forces in Japan included organizations of youth, women, workers, the Peace Committee, the Vietnamese-Japanese Friendship Committee, the Bahaian Organization, Citizens League for Peace in Vietnam, and representatives of the Japanese Communist Party. They organized many activities to oppose the U.S. war of aggression. Thousands of people held sit-ins at Japanese ports to prevent the United States from sending war material to Vietnam. They organized a movement, a yen for Vietnamese women and children. The Japanese have been victims of the 2 U.S. nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These friends could easily feel sympathy with the people of Vietnam. Many countries in Africa and Latin America viewed Vietnam as a model. Their government support and help was great, with results in many areas. By the time we liberated the South on April 30th, 1975, the PRG had received official diplomatic recognition from 65 countries, with the number of African countries second to the number of socialist countries. I visited many countries in Africa, the huge continent. We know that Africa was the cradle of human beings, yet the level of economic development and living standards remains young in comparison with other continents. The thirst of each person everywhere is the same. And so, whether Africans at that time knew a little or a lot about politics, they sympathized with the struggle of Vietnamese who had been oppressed and exploited like them. I took part in many international gatherings, from international solidarity conferences to governmental meetings. Vietnam's position received a consistently warm response from many African governments, particularly Algeria, Guinea, Mali, Madagascar, and Tanzania. Throughout his life, Algerian President Houari Boumediene and Foreign Minister Abdelaziz Bouteflika, currently the President of Algeria, strongly supported the Vietnamese struggle and regarded it as their own people's struggle. President Boumediene paid close attention to my travels to build international relations. Once, he said to me, "I invite you to travel free of charge whenever you are on a mission to a country covered by our airline." Even now, and even though our two countries have developed differently, Algerians speaking of Vietnam will place their hands over there. Hut and say, Ho Chi Minh, Dien Bien Phu, Vong Nguyen Giáp. Our African friends' empathy and admiration for Vietnam remain. After we achieved independence, many African nations also developed along the lines of socialism, but most of those nations lost direction after the socialist bloc disintegrated. Many currently face difficulties, including increased divisions among religious, racial, and ethnic groups. They look toward Vietnam in hopes of drawing from our experience. As for the Americas, at that time, I was able to visit only Cuba. Comrade Fidel Castro and the Cuban people left a deep impression on me. Melba Hernandez, president of the Committee for Solidarity with Vietnam, retained a special feeling for Vietnamese and was a particularly close Cuban sister. Several thousand Cuban youths volunteered to join the struggle in Vietnam. Our Cuban friends showed their deepest feelings when encouraging the Vietnamese people during our cruel resistance war. In speaking of Cuba, we always remember the revolutionary Che Guevara. I'd had occasion to read a number of the letters that Che Guevara had sent to Fidel Castro and to friends in Bolivia. It is rare to find such ardent revolutionary feelings and thoughts. Those revolutionaries' greatest happiness was to serve the cause of justice. This point explains why the revolutionary warriors in Latin America, and even as far away as Venezuela, were so moved by Vietnamese hero Nguyen Van Troy. Guerrillas in Venezuela captured an American officer and offered to exchange the officer for Nguyen Van Troy. Even though their initiative failed, we prize the effort of these friends far away in South America. Only recently have we learned details of that story. Early in August 1964, Commander Luis Correa of the Unidades Tácticas de Combate, UTC, a leftist tactical combat unit, announced that in Vietnam an electrician named Nguyen Van Troy had attempted to assassinate U.S. Secretary of Defense McNamara. Luis Correa reported that the attempt had failed, Troy had been arrested, and the Saigon administration would execute Troy. Mr. Correa assigned a UTC action unit with 12 members to capture an American, whom the UTC would exchange for Troy. The 12-man unit divided into 4 subgroups, with each assigned to one of 4 tasks: capture the American, transport him, guard him, and negotiate. The subgroup that captured U.S. Air Force Colonel Michael Smolin included 5 men: Noel Quintero, leader; Carlos Rey, David Salazar, Raul Rodriguez, and Carlos Arguines Martinez. The attempted exchange of the American prisoner to rescue Nguyen Van Troy failed. Nevertheless, we so value the feelings of these friends from South America who joined us in the struggle. In Chile, on November 4th, 1970, the Marxists achieved victory in the elections. Salvador Allende came to power. Although his cause was short-lived, he was assassinated by Pinochet. His government expanded the revolution and, in particular, made clear its support for the Vietnamese. People's struggle. Shortly after Allende took office, he announced on March 25, 1971, the establishment of diplomatic relations with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. President Allende even covered the expenses for the 2 Vietnamese offices. From the beginning of the 20th century, a leftist movement began to flourish in Latin America, the backyard of American imperialism. Today, these countries understand U.S. neocolonialism and search for ways to benefit their own people and create worldwide peace and justice. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Of course, I could not visit the United States during the war years, but I did meet Americans at gatherings organized by U.S. groups opposed to the war. Many U.S. delegations came to Paris to visit us, including congressional representatives, families of American prisoners, women, and youth opposed to the war. They made a beautiful impression on us, particularly the American women, who wanted the war to end and to have peace so their husbands and sons could avoid the draft and an early death. They were filled with sorrow and embarrassment after they learned that their husbands and sons had perpetrated extreme acts of cruelty on the Vietnamese people. In 1971, Women's Strike for Peace organized a meeting in Canada where American women met with women from the 3 countries of Indochina. Some of the U.S. women announced, "The Vietnamese women are not the enemy. They are our sisters." There were many demonstrations, often with women as the majority of the participants. A photograph from a demonstration in Miami, Florida in 1972 contains a detail particularly moving to me. One of the sisters is wearing a T-shirt with an image of Madam Ben and the slogan, "Live like her." I recently learned that many women wore Madam Ben T-shirts at demonstrations across the United States. Those American women were supporting a Viet Cong woman leader. Yet at that same time, in South Vietnam, American soldiers were being ordered to kill any Viet Cong they saw. Those American women were truly courageous. Many Americans from different strata of society ardently opposed the U.S. war and supported Vietnam. I want our people always to remember the names of 10 Americans, among them 5 youth, who immolated themselves to give voice to the American people's choking anger about the meaningless American war in Vietnam. They were peace warriors and war martyrs. Just as President Ho Chi Minh cited, asterisk, 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 in speaking about the friends in the U.S. anti-war movement, Dave Dellinger is the person I want to emphasize the most. I could say he was the president of the American peace movement, demanding an end to the Van Vietnam. He was one of the first Americans to visit North Vietnam, and also someone who held firmly to his positions on peace and justice. Tom Hayden, an anti-war movement leader, loved Jane Fonda. Their sense of purpose was the struggle to demand an end to the American war in Vietnam. They named their son Troy in memory of Nguyen Van Troy. Cora Weiss is a famous and tireless woman activist. Many women in the peace movement, such as Carol Brightman, named their children Ben Peace out of their love for Vietnam. By now, there may be a dozen American women named Ben. And, of course, it is impossible to forget the great humanitarians, Dr. Benjamin Spock and Jane Cheney Spock. I have an adopted son, Rennie Davis, an American youth who used all his strength in the movement to support Vietnam. Davis was a very sensitive young man who worked tirelessly in the U.S. anti-war movement. At the end of 1969, Davis came to Paris, where we met and where he asked me to accept him as an adopted son, although mother and son had not yet had the occasion to know each other well. The following year, Davis met me again and asked why, after so lengthy a struggle, the war had not ended. I explained and encouraged Davis to believe in our ultimate victory, but perhaps I was unable to persuade him. After that, I never met Davis again, but I heard from a number of American friends that he had moved to India and entered a monastery. In fact, that wasn't the truth at all. In 2013, Rennie Davis and his wife were on a list of Americans visiting Vietnam to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Agreement. I was so delighted to meet Davis again. He had not entered a monastery in India, as rumors had led me to believe, but instead had continued his activism in the United States. Only during this recent meeting did I come to understand more fully his anti-war accomplishments. This increased my affection for him. Rennie was among the Chicago Seven and had been selected by the New York Times as one of the most important political figures in U.S. history. He had organized large anti-war demonstrations, including the one at the Democratic Party's National Convention in 1968. These days, Rennie works in technology and leadership training. Rennie has an idea to assist Vietnam with many projects. In particular, he wants to help produce inexpensive computer hardware of high quality because he knows Vietnam still has many challenges. The sentiments of my close American friends remain deep. Some people are especially precious to me. Even now, they remain faithful to the cause of Vietnam struggle. I think, for example, of Merle Ratner, older sister Mo, the wife of Professor No Tan Nan. Even though Merle has no personal wealth, she is there with help whenever Vietnam has a request. These international friends are people who live according to political and humane ideals. Their happiness comes from following those ideals. It would take a long time to tell all the stories of our friends on the 5 continents. The points I want to record here are not only from my own personal experience, but also perhaps from the common experience of all of us. During the struggle, we suffered losses and savored our gains against the enemy. We always kept in mind the party's crucial guideline. We must unify all our own people and, after that, unify internationally. In truth, this directive was ingenious. Suppose we had not taken full advantage of the assistance from the Soviet Union, China, and the Socialist Bloc. Suppose we had let ourselves be stopped by the conflicts and by the cross-purposes between those countries. If so, we would surely not have received their political support and military and financial assistance. Taken together, that aid gave us the means to secure victory. Suppose Vietnam had not enjoyed an international solidarity movement, particularly in the United States. If so, we could not have shaken Washington's aggressive will. The memoirs of many politicians from the American administrations at that time also make this point. The U.S. administrations had to address the widespread public opinion opposing the meaningless war they had created in Vietnam. The U.S. anti-war movement in solidarity with Vietnam drew from many forces: communists, leftists, progressive people, those who simply love peace and justice, and others. This political and material strength shook the most stubborn, conservative, and warlike minds in the U.S. political leadership. The Vietnamese people have great appreciation for the peace and anti-war movements in the United States and view those movement contributions as important in shortening the war and reestablishing peace in Vietnam. Not long ago, an American film team visiting Vietnam asked me, "Is it true that Vietnam profited from the divisions within the United States?" "No," I answered. "We don't think that way. The work that we did took advantage of the American people's spirit, which prizes peace and justice, to oppose again and again the useless and destructive war in Vietnam, which provided no benefit for the American people. It is fortunate that many Americans, particularly the women, understood this point and stood on the side of common sense and peace. That made possible the path leading to later reconciliation between the people of our two nations. The press and mass media also played a major role. At times, people called the press and mass media the second authority after the administrative authority. Journalists dared to speak the truth and, despite intimidation and punishment, accurately portrayed our suffering and the demands of the anti-war movement. Their work affected the U.S. government's attitudes and policies. Most of all, I must speak about the progressive journalists who dared to visit the NLFPRG liberated areas to report on our soldiers and on our people's war. They were prepared to accept every sacrifice and endure every imaginable difficulty. We will always remember Madeleine Riffaud, who spoke from her heart, saying, "Vietnam is a part of my life." Along with her were many other journalists from El Humanite, the newspaper of the French Communist Party. Wilfred Burchett was always jovial and smiling. Burchett published interviews, which had a huge effect on public opinion, so much so that, although he was an Australian citizen, he was not allowed to return to Australia. Then there was the Bulgarian woman writer Dimitrova and older sister Vanessa, who was Polish. We are also indebted to the hundreds of journalists who stuck to the Paris conference from beginning to end in order to distribute news about the seemingly endless negotiations. We must recognize the American journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CBS television, as well as the AP and UPI news agencies. They were dedicated to capturing the situation and the news. In time, they helped Americans and other peoples follow the war and see clearly the frightfully violent rain of bombs, the ghastly massacres, the imprisonment of ordinary citizens, and the painful loss of American soldiers. We must recognize journalists Seymour Hersh and Don Luce, as well as many other international journalists who courageously exposed the truth. Through their efforts, public opinion, particularly in the United States, learn about the My Lai massacre and the notorious tiger cages in the prison on Con Dao Island. The world heard about so many other cruelties perpetrated by the U.S. aggressors. After the war, I had the chance to see documentary films of tremendous value by filmmakers from Canada, Belgium, and other countries. I came to understand more about what was known on this side and that side during the long and endlessly cruel war in Vietnam. Finally, I want to say that all of us active in the diplomatic front can affirm this point. The battlefield decides the results at the negotiating table. The struggle and sacrifice of our troops and our people in every victorious step. During decades of struggle conquered the hearts and minds of progressive peoples across the world and eventually forced the enemy to submit. Endlessly important to the Southern battlefield was this: our stable rear guard in the socialist North, where for years every person truly lived and worked every day with the spirit of everything for the South, everything for our kin. Vietnam's struggle for independence and freedom lasted for more than 20 years, filled with excruciating sacrifices requiring endless heroism from our people. Our struggle has become a symbol receiving the world's esteem. Yet the strong spirit of international unity has not yet reached the millions and millions of the world's deserving people who are still struggling. I am extremely proud of my country, of our people, and of our friends. Reunification of the country. April 30th, 1975 is memorable in our country's history and, for me, a day I can never forget. For 20 years, our people in both the South and the North had earnestly wished for reunification of our homeland. For 20 years, our country was divided. For 20 years, families were separated. For 20 years, wives and husbands waited for each other. For the first time after 20 years, some 20-year-old adults finally saw their fathers' faces. Some of my friends, standing amidst this indescribable exuberance, faced equally indescribable sorrow. They'd been unable to find their father or mother, or a bomb had killed their husband or wife and their children. For them, joy lay buried beneath bombs and military mopping-up operations. A few days before May 13th, 1975, I traveled from Hanoi to Saigon with comrades in the leadership. Even though I had lived in Saigon and had been an activist there, I could no longer recognize areas of the city. Our troops' general offensive and the people's uprising had liberated Saigon, but in many places it seemed as if everything were still intact. This was marvelous. During the resistance war against France, I had lived with my family at the memorial to Elder Phan Chow Trin, my maternal grandfather, near to Cow Market in Ward 5, District 3. On returning in 1975, I was surprised to find still standing the memorial to Grandfather Phan. The surrounding neighborhoods where we had tacked up our propaganda posters and held our demonstrations so many years before were still there. Yet everything was in disorder, chaotic, and confused. Perhaps this was one of the negative after effects of the war. So many people had abandoned their homes in the rural areas and fled to the city to avoid bombs and mortars, as well as to earn a living. They had crowded into Saigon and into my former neighborhood. In other areas, the Saigon authorities had widened the streets, and the buildings were far grander, with imposing villas, tall buildings, and elegant shops displaying a surfeit of foreign goods. The American military had dominated some areas of the city for 20 years, investing billions of dollars. The most symbolic trace of the former Saigon administration was Independence Palace. The new administration immediately changed its name to Unification Palace. The Americans and the Saigon administration had fled the city during the recent turbulence, but by now, the streets were peaceful under our new administration. The people were exuberant. Surely, some people associated with the previous administration remained worried. However, their worries abated when they saw that the Liberation Army soldiers were not barbaric. As a local citizenry had been told, the huge event on May 13th in front of Unification Palace was solemn and monumental. On the long presidium sat the Provisional Revolutionary Government's most senior leaders, Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter, and others, along with comrades from the leadership of the Vietnamese Workers' Party, now the Vietnamese Communist Party. That group include Un So Tôn Đức Thắng, Co Mát Lê Duẩn, Pham Hung, and others. For the first time, the people of Saigon saw the party and state leaders whose names and work they had known for decades, but only through newspapers and radio. PRG Council of Government President Nguyen Thi Binh spoke, praising the troops and the people who had fought so heroically. They had achieved a glorious victory as well as independence, freedom, and reunification for our magnificent homeland. A parade followed. Our foot soldiers carrying their weapons marched by, and then we watched a display of the Liberation Army's military equipment. Everyone in Saigon was in the streets during those historic days in the middle of May 1975. We all understood that now we could really live in peace. The South had achieved liberation, and we had reunited our homeland from the northern tip at Nam Quan to the southern tip at Samao. I was indescribably buoyant during that ceremony, as were the millions of others who had lived through the two fierce resistance wars. At times, I felt as if I were dreaming. I was endlessly moved to meet old friends after decades of separation, particularly the brothers and sisters with whom I had been in prison at Chihoa. We had all aged markedly. Many comrades had passed on. They would never be among us again. We had endless stories to share about our activities in the resistance, the different fronts where we had served, and our families. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. My most pressing task was to search for my younger brother, whom the Saigon authorities had imprisoned on Condau Island in 1968, when I began participating in the Paris Conference. At that time, I was an activist in Saigon. The gang of informers knew he was the younger brother of Nguyen Thi Binh. The Saigon police arrested him. Ha endured every type of corporal punishment during the fierce questioning before they exiled him to Condau. For nearly 7 years, he lived there in a tiger cage, a far crueler cell than those of the Middle Ages. Perhaps my younger brother's pain was not just that he was tortured from the outset, but rather a deeper, far sharper pain. His wife, Tu Swang, was also arrested because she was Ha's wife and because Ha was the younger brother of Madam Bin and a grandson of Fan Chao Trin. Ha's wife had just given birth. Their baby, who was not yet 2 months old, was also taken to prison. Tu Swang was in prison for 6 years, including 2 years at Condau. Theirs was the pain of so many families during the resistance. With mothers and fathers both in prison, the children also became prisoners, or the children were sent to relatives for a time here, for a time there. I knew that on May 1st, 1975, the day after Saigon's liberation, the Revolutionary Administration sent boats to fetch the brothers and sisters in the Condau prison. Hi, my 4th younger sibling, and I went from one reception camp to another, searching for Ha. We witnessed countless reunions between close family members, the uncontrollable emotions, people laughing, crying. Finally, we arrived at Hung Vong Reception Center and found our brother, Nguyen Dong Ha, whom we had not seen for 21 years. He was pale, but not gaunt. Although he had aged terribly, his eyes were bright. Although he looked exhausted, he still could smile. While my father was still alive, his eyes would fill with tears whenever anyone mentioned my younger brother in prison. Ha and I hugged each other as if we would never let go. Ha's wife and children had also arrived. We left for the house of Ha's wife, Tu Swang, who had been released earlier. As a District 1 official, she had received an apartment on Pham Galao Street. It had been so long since we had been together, although we still did not have with us our 3 younger siblings who were in Hanoi. Several months later, we had a chance to have everyone together at the shrine for Elder Fan. By this time, most of our younger siblings had married. I was nearly 40 years old when he married, and so he had children late. Lone and her husband had both graduated from Tsinghua University in China. They had a son and then later a daughter. Ho had married and had faced difficulties. But by this point, his family situation was tranquil. Only Hao had yet to establish a family. A soldier for 7 years, he had hiked down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. After our mother's early death, I tried to step into her place and help my siblings as they grew to adulthood. Now, there remained only Hao, the youngest, of whom I was terribly fond. I can say that he probably bore the greatest loss in our family. I had yet to complete my responsibility, for I still needed to help him secure family happiness. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Although I was busy with my family, I needed to return quickly to professional responsibilities since I was still the PRG foreign minister. Several brothers and sisters in the PRG ministry took over the Saigon regime's foreign ministry offices and began working there. Soon, we transferred the PRG's foreign ministry from Cam Lo in Quang Tri province to Saigon. I assigned Comrade Hong Bich's son, our deputy foreign minister, and several other officials to take direct responsibility in Saigon. I continued to work in Hanoi until complete reunification in July 1976. The major political issue was when to unite the state administration. Some held that complete reunification required no discussion since the people in both sectors longed for a unified country and since independence and reunification had been the basic goals of our people's continuous struggle for decades. However, others thought we should preserve two administrations for a time. These colleagues pointed to the two different political systems that had been in place. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRVN, was already established as a socialist state, whereas the Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG, of South Vietnam was still a nationalist, independent, and neutral state. The NLF-PRG platform was carefully neither pro-socialist nor pro-capitalist. These colleagues urged that we keep the South as it was in order to secure outside cooperation and assistance from socialist, nationalist, and capitalist nations and their organizations. In the end, we unanimously accepted the proposal to implement complete reunification of the country and its ministries, departments, and organizations as soon as possible. I raised my hand in agreement. Now, looking back after many years, I know that this guideline was correct. Prolonging the division and its differences might have given the United States the advantages needed in order to meddle. The situation might have become more complicated and difficult. We can look at other divided countries and see that our decision was appropriate. Usually, when we re-examine an issue, we might say this side or that side should have been more flexible. However, this basic decision was correct and far-sighted. On June 17, 1975, a large, historic meeting took place at the Unification Palace between the Fatherland Front of Vietnam, the North, and the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, the South. The leaders of both fronts attended. I was also there. The discussion was heated, but also serious and filled with a sense of responsibility. President Nguyen Thi, though, presented the NLF's contributions during 15 years opposing the United States. Since the front had now completed its historic responsibilities, he proposed establishing a unified front for the entire country to facilitate early reunification in all fields. This consultative conference decided to establish a nationwide front, the Vietnamese Fatherland Front. The newly forming Interim Fatherland Front then proposed nationwide National Assembly elections for 1976. In April 1976, candidates for the Vieth National Assembly, counting from the first National Assembly election in 1946, went to the localities to mobilize the electorate. I was introduced to serve as a candidate for Saigon's Districts 4, 7, and 8, as well as Condau Island, which at that time belonged to Saigon City. Kulma Pham Hung, Jun Van Jia, Nguyen Thi Binh, and others were on the same list of candidates. This was the first time in many years that I mingled with the people of Saigon. The voters came out in large numbers to see the faces of those in the PRG whose names they had been hearing for a long time. Older brother Tra and I went to Condau. The population there was thinly scattered. We toured the areas where the enemy had held our revolutionary warriors. From the cattle barn of French colonialism to the tiger cages of U.S. imperialism. The local authorities had cleaned up the area. Nevertheless, we stared at the instruments used to intimidate and torture the brothers and sisters whom the Saigon authorities had held as political prisoners. I felt keenly aware that I'd been the beneficiary of countless lives sacrificed by the comrades who had gone before me. The election results were announced in June 1976. I was one of the candidates to receive the most votes. I served as a representative in the National Assembly from the 20th session, 1976 to 1981, continuously through the XDH session, 1997 to 2002. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In August 1976, I returned to Hanoi. Comrade Lu Van Luong, then a Politburo member and head of the party's Central-Level Organizing Committee, came to see me. He suggested I accept the position of Minister of Education in the new government. He said this responsibility was very important in this next stage of building the country. The comrades had noticed in my curriculum vitae that I had been a teacher. I was completely surprised. I had gathered some experience during more than 14 years working in foreign affairs. It seemed to me that continuing in foreign affairs would better use my capabilities. Yet faced with Comrade Lu Van Luong's encouragement, I felt I should accept the party's assignment. After reunification, one issue during 1977 and 1978 left me constantly uneasy. The party promulgated Directive Z 30 to transform the capitalist industries and commerce in the former South to socialism. One of my husband's younger sisters and her family had opened a store selling Western medicine in Cholon. Appearance of their names on the list for transformation paralyzed them. All their pharmaceutical goods were confiscated and their store was sealed. I went to visit. Husband and wife were terribly worried. I tried to explain the policy, but at the bottom of my heart, I was very uneasy. I couldn't understand what good could come of this. Surely, my family could not continue to run their drugstore. I never saw them again. Later, I learned that this guideline was re-examined, but I wondered, had the leaders drawn from deep experience? Had they realized the depth of the negative results? I continued my PRG diplomatic activities from 1975 until September 1976, when I moved to the Ministry of Education. In July 1975, the non-aligned movement, NAM, foreign ministers met in Lima, Peru, the first Latin American country I visited after Cuba. The president of Peru gave our PRG delegation a warm welcome and congratulated us on the Vietnamese people's great victory. He presented me with a precious gift, a bracelet made from a strand of gold. However, during the conference, there was a peaceful coup in Peru and a new president. We were worrying about the new administration's attitude when the Peruvian foreign minister passed along the new president's message. Friends, be at ease. Although Peru has undergone an internal change, we still support and esteem the Vietnamese people. A major agenda item for the NAM foreign ministers meeting was discussion of new members to be admitted. Among the candidates were the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRVN, North Vietnam, North Korea, South Korea, and the Philippines. At this time, the DRVN had not participated in the non-aligned movement, although the PRG was an official member. Nguyen Thi led the DRVN delegation. Of course, the DRVN met no difficulty, since our two delegations each encouraged the other countries to accept the DRVN. The PRG's prestige was high from the Vietnamese victory. Other nations facing thorny problems often came to ask for our suggestions. During this particular meeting, the most difficult issue was South Korea's possible admission into NAM. Of course, the PRG would support North Korea and oppose South Korea. South Korea had supported U.S. policies during the war. even to the extent of sending soldiers to occupy South Vietnam. Those troops had perpetrated many atrocities against our people. Thus, our delegation said, we could not call South Korea a non-aligned nation. Some NAM members supported the Philippines' admission, but other delegations refused their support after we informed everyone that U.S. airplanes had left airbases in the Philippines to bomb Vietnam. One DRVN delegation member questioned whether we should think of the future and support the Philippines. Yet how could we forget the recent past? When the tears of our compatriots, the mothers of sons sacrificed in the war, had not dried. Several months later, when Ko Thatch and I went with several other comrades to Mexico, Venezuela, and other countries to research the possibilities of exploiting Vietnam's natural reserves of oil. After liberation, our first worry had been securing sufficient rice for our people. Our second concern was petrol. The cooperation between Vietnam and the Soviet Union on development of Vietnamese oil reserves began during this period. However, first we had to borrow oil for economic and military activities, as well as for our people's daily life. In October 1975, 3 of us, comrade truck from the office of the government, an interpreter, and I visited Algeria, Libya, and Iraq to borrow oil. Even though these friendly countries supported Vietnam, addressing economic matters was not easy. Nevertheless, we were able to borrow oil for immediate use with preferential interest rates. The visit to Iraq left me with deep impressions. At that time, Saddam Hussein, whom many of the Iraqi people regarded as a hero, had just become vice president of Iraq. Hearing Vietnam's urgent request, he answered immediately, saying, "We will give Vietnam 400,000 tons of oil and lend 1.5 million tons with a preferred interest rate." I heard this, but I could not believe my ears. I asked the interpreter whether he was sure this was true. We were so touched by this gesture from our Iraqi friends. Later, Iraq suffered under the embargo and had to exchange oil for food. Nevertheless, our friends continued to sign commercial contracts favorable to us during the years when we had many economic difficulties. In 2002, I went back to Iraq to address our debt of more than 20 years, which we still had not completely repaid. According to suggestions from our government, we proposed transferring the debt into investment in an economic project in Vietnam. When I met Saddam Hussein to propose this idea, he laughed and said, "You Vietnamese friends needn't worry. I know you face difficulties. We will view this debt as paid." Once again, I was so touched, for I knew Iraq was suffering from an American embargo and experiencing its own difficulties on every front. We all know how the situation in Iraq has changed. U.S. President George Bush mobilized a war against Iraq by accusing Saddam Hussein of a relationship with the al-Qaeda terrorist forces and the production of weapons of mass destruction. Later, the world learned that these accusations were bold lies invented to implement a scheme for U.S. profit. Iraqi history will decide whether Saddam Hussein made mistakes domestically, internationally, or against his own people. Nevertheless, I think we Vietnamese should be grateful for his much-needed assistance throughout the early years when our country was recovering from war. During the war against the United States and Vietnam, I had many opportunities to travel to the Middle East. This region is wealthy because large oil reserves lie beneath its dry sands. Yet perhaps these many seams of black gold keep the people from having tranquil lives. I harbor deep feelings about the fate of the Palestinian people and their struggle for an independent Palestinian state. When will they achieve victory? Palestinians must still live like refugees from their own ancestral homes. Once when I was visiting Iraq, our interpreter was an Iraqi married to a Palestinian who had sacrificed himself in the independence struggle. Their 20-year-old daughter, who was strong and beautiful, had just finished university in Beirut, Lebanon. She said, "I don't know what my future will be. Like most of my friends, I will follow the call of our leader, Arafat." Her soft, calm words moved me deeply. So many Palestinian youth have fallen and will fall during the unequal struggle so they can have their own country, their own homeland. After the reunification of Vietnam, I left the diplomatic service where I have been active for many years and moved to education. This was a huge step for me. Now looking back, I can see that my growth as a public servant continued. The lessons I had accumulated in my diplomatic service were useful for my next assignment. A united front opposing the United States and the Saigon administration. After April 30th, 1975, I was again able to meet close friends I had not seen in more than 20 years. This was a great joy. I also met once more many people whom I had known in different situations. Now, we were each far older and each had somewhat different views. Together, we reviewed the experiences that had led us to follow different routes during those difficult times under French colonialism and American imperialism. We asked each other about our lives, sharing our innermost emotions and private hopes. I heard many simple, heartfelt words expressing such deep feelings, but also many secret, opposing, and worrisome thoughts. Many times, I have returned to Ho Chi Minh City on a work assignment, and in particular for anniversaries of the liberation of the South on April 30th. I have taken the time when there to share stories with these brothers and sisters, along with those whom I had known by name only but had not met. I had known Lawyer Tran Ngoc Liang when we were activists with Lawyer Nguyen Thi though. Now, he was living in a monastery, as he said, for peace of mind. Others, such as Professor Lai Chan Trung and Priest Huyen Song Min and Phan Coc Tu, had been representatives in the Saigon National Assembly several years before. Duan Li Sit Li Gui Chung, Ho Ngoc Nguyen, and Not Song Duc had been members of the opposition in the Saigon National Assembly's lower house. These days, when the Ho Chi Minh City leaders speak at post-war celebrations, they emphasize our people's glorious victory in returning independence and unification to our homeland. They praise the important contributions of the army and political leadership in the struggle to liberate the country in general and Saigon in particular. I have often suggested that when they speak of the political forces in the South, they should also talk about the third force and its role in national reconciliation and concord. However, these comrades remain hesitant to engage this issue. I think the situation is not yet as it should be. As an insider, I've had the opportunity to know and understand some truths, which perhaps have been forgotten. I feel it is my responsibility to speak out about those points. It is terribly difficult to gain complete clarity on all matters that occurred during our people's prolonged struggle. We had many secret activities in many different places, at many different times, with many different lines of communication. We who held positions of responsibility and who are still living must make the truth clear. We must be sure no one is forgotten. This is a fundamental truth for me, because I believe each of us has only one life. Thus, we should never allow a person's life to languish in misunderstanding. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The National Liberation Front, NLF, of South Vietnam came into being in 1960. It lifted aloft the flag of solidarity, gathering many straight-of people together in order to end the war of aggression, liberate the South, and reunite our homeland. The Alliance of National Democratic and Peace Forces was established after Tet 1968, the Year of the Monkey. If the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam is considered the first force, then the alliance would be the second force. Following the alliance, other political and social organizations appeared in Saigon, including the women's movement for the right to life and the movement to protect the national culture. The Buddhists and Catholics also organized many groups and actions to demand peace and national reconciliation. These groups became the third force. Before the signing of the Paris Agreement in January 1973, Comrade Le Duan, the party general secretary, sent a letter to the party's central level for the South. He wrote, "You must hasten to pull together the various groups advocating peace, independence, democracy, and national reconciliation to form a third force in order to split and isolate the oppositional forces even more, and to direct a spearhead into few and the most warlike factions close to the United States. You need to research how to expand the National Liberation Front and the National Alliance of Democratic and Peace Forces as appropriate to the new situation. At the same time, you need to organize well and unite your activities with a third force to oppose the U.S. Few forces. As we all know, in 1973, after 4 years of negotiations, the balance of forces between us and the enemy compelled the Americans to end their war in the South, withdraw their soldiers and their satellite state from the South, and end their air war against the North. During the negotiations, we relaxed our position on the political administration in the South. We no longer demanded that the Paris Agreement require Thew's resignation and the removal of the Saigon administration. Instead, we required only a National Council for Reconciliation and Concord with 3 sectors, the PRG, the Saigon administration, and the third force. This council would implement the Paris Agreement's points leading toward a nationwide election. After the 4 parties signed the Paris Agreement, the Saigon administration refused to implement its provisions. Rather, it sent troops to occupy our liberated areas, froze out the Reconciliation Conference, and continued fighting to its final bullet and its last grain of rice. Many political organizations, some associated with the third force, demanded that President Thieu apply the Paris Agreement and implement national reconciliation and concord. Many also demanded his resignation. Ma'am Mo Ba Tang, an intellectual famous for her courageous spirit in the struggle, was a leader of the women's movement for the right to life. She officially labeled herself as Third Force. The Thieu administration arrested No Ba Tan, but then public pressure forced the Saigon regime to release her. On October 8, 1973, No Ba Tan stood before intellectuals, many representatives of the Saigon National Assembly, Saigon administration officials, and foreign journalists. She announced, "We are indeed the third political force." Lawyer Tran Ngoc Liang, whom I knew maintained close ties to the NLF, had been on the same ticket with General Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter in the presidential elections and was a member of Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter's group. Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter returned to Saigon from Thailand after the Paris Conference. Mr. Tran Ngoc Liang established the People's Organization, demanding implementation of the Paris Agreement. He announced, "We are part of the third force." At that time, Zhang Yin Sving on Jung Văn Minh Thap in Lut Professor Li Jiangjung, Khiet Nguyen Ngoc Lan, and ZPK from Saigon National Assembly, Su AS Hong Ngoc Nguyen, Jung Văn Ba, Mo Kong Đức, Li Quy Trung, and O Ther, all had direct or indirect relations with the NLF in Saigon or Paris. Their clear position in the middle stood for reconciliation between the first and second parties, the NLF-PRG and the Thieu administration. These men were patriots, but they were not communists. During the Paris negotiations, we, particularly Sister Nguyen Thi Chan and Brother Phan Nan, educated, and mobilized those who supported our just position. This work included organizing with overseas Vietnamese who came from the South on visits to Paris. We increased our base of action inside the country by encouraging intellectuals to return home, among them Ton Nhu Thi Ninh, Tran Ha Tai, Tinoc Du, Bui Tran Phuong, and others. Many brothers and sisters who returned home were zealous activists in the Third Force. Later, they held important positions to help rebuild the country. After the Paris Agreement took effect, Mr. Nguyen Thi Binh, former Minister of Interior from the Ngo Dinh Diem administration, Mr. O Truong Tan, former Minister of Economy in the Thu Khai Kim administration, both held press conferences outside the country on behalf of the Third Force. They requested the two sides in South Vietnam seriously implement the Paris Agreement and quickly establish the National Council for Reconciliation and Concord with its three sectors. On January 16, 1975, the Third Force in Paris organized a day for the South, demanding the United States oust Thieu. By April 26, 1975, our army was pressuring Saigon. Comrade Dinh Ba Thi was in Paris, serving as deputy head of the PRG representative delegation at the consultative conference between the two sides in South Vietnam. He announced the PRG's two position points. The United States must strictly implement provisions 1, 4, and 9 of the Paris Agreement. The Saigon administration must be abolished. Its neo-colonial and war apparatus must be eliminated, and its system of domination over the people of South Vietnam must end. At that time, French and international public opinion perceived this as a call for the Saigon administration's surrender. We invited Mr. Ngo Song Duc and priest Nguyen Dinh Thi to our office in Paris to inform them of this announcement. On April 27, 1975, Mr. Ngo Song Duc flew from Paris to Thailand. BK Saigon International Airport was an incoming flight to inform Mr. Nguyen Văn Minh. Asterisk. I want to make clearer the role of Mr. Nguyen Văn Minh and his group with regard to their position on implementing national reconciliation. Why? On the very day our troops expanded our historic Ho Chi Minh campaign, did Nguyen Văn Minh and his group switch from the Third Force and stand up to replace the Thieu administration and establish a cabinet with Nguyen Văn Minh as president? We must remember October 8th, 1974, when the PRG promulgated its position regarding the situation in South Vietnam. We demanded that the United States terminate its military involvement and intervention in the internal affairs of South Vietnam, overthrow Nguyen Van Thieu, and establish in Saigon an administration agreeing to peace and national reconciliation as well to implementation of the Paris Agreement. According to many documents we now have, the events occurred as follows. After the signing of the Paris Agreement on January 27, 1973, the Saigon administration grew weaker on every front, making a coup possible. Members of Nguyen Van Minh's staff decided that they must overthrow Thieu, establish a peace cabinet, and negotiate with the PRG to end the war. They reasoned that no other group could do this. Further, they were quite sure the PRG would accept negotiations because Nguyen Van Minh's group had had direct and indirect relations with the PRG and had joined the struggle against the U.S. Thieu regime in the capital. Nevertheless, the members of Nguyen Van Minh's group had to resolve their internal, opposing ideas, a process that continued until the beginning of April 1975. Almost a month before the collapse of the Thieu administration, this group announced its decision to replace Thieu in order to end the war, even if it had to hold aloft the white flag of surrender. As for Nguyen Van Minh's role, a document from the Secretariat of the party's central level provides this evaluation. Although Mr. Nguyen Thi Binh had not yet implemented all our requests. His announcement on April 30 and the order promulgated by Nguyen Thi Binh contained decisive content. It lessened the Saigon army's will to resist in the final hours of the war, thereby creating the conditions for our armed forces to accelerate the liberation of Saigon. I think this evaluation is satisfactory. However, if we search more deeply into Mr. Nguyen Thi Binh's background and listen to the accounts of the progressive people around him, then we can see that Nguyen Thi Binh's actions reflect his knowledge of the world and show that he was a patriot. On the morning of April 30th, 1975, French General Van Uxem asked to see President Nguyen Thi Binh. Mr. Vu Van Mao was present at this meeting with General Van Uxem. In 1963, when he was foreign minister, Mr. Vu Van Mao had shaved his head in opposition to the Ngo Dinh Diem administration's oppression of the Buddhists. In early 1975, Mr. Mao, then serving as president of the Nquang Buddhist Movement for Reconciliation and Concord, met in Paris with Pham Van Ba, director of our PRG Information Bureau. At the end of April 1975, Mr. Mao was asked by President Min to serve as prime minister. Mr. Vu Van Mao was amazed to hear General Van Uxem's proposal. General Van Uxem said to President Min, "The situation is not at all without hope. I have just finished making arrangements in Paris. You should make a call for outside intervention from another country. That country will intervene immediately. I can arrange to be the liaison. I would liaise from here." Nguyen Thi Binh said, "I have no more time. I don't have even a single day." After General Van Uxem left, those who had attended the meeting with Nguyen Thi Binh returned to their seats. Mr. Nguyen Thi Binh said, "We sold our nation to France and then to the United States. Now he wants to help us to sell our country a third time." In addition to selecting Vu Van Mao to serve as Prime Minister, Nguyen Thi Binh made other important appointments. Mr. Nguyen Thi Binh, a former ARVN general, had been an efficient corps agent, that is, a spy, for our secret Central-Level Agitation Committee for the South. Mr. Nguyen Thi Binh appointed him Chief of Staff of the ARVN General Headquarters. As our Army's lightning offensive against Saigon began, Mr. Min appointed lawyer Tru Quoc Man, an underground member of the Communist Party, as the city's police chief with responsibility, among other tasks, to free political prisoners immediately and dismantle the old administration's police forces. Lastly, according to Nguyen Thi Binh, former president of the Saigon Students Association, Mr. Nguyen Thi Binh had housed Man, thereby helping him avoid the secret police. Before that, from 1972, General Nguyen Thi Binh had stood up in support of the youth and student movements opposing the Thieu administration. Nguyen Thi Binh referred to himself in an intimate, friendly way as Qua. Crossover in his message to the youth. Qua knows the direction you youth are taking. Qua support you. The truth is that Qua supports establishment of the third force. But Qua wishes to remain on the outside and change the existing administration in order to speak about reconciliation and concord with the National Liberation Front. The actual events in Saigon at the end of April 1975 prove that Mr. Nguyen Thi Binh did indeed stand up, just as he had planned. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. My colleagues and I who were active in the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam spent many years concentrating on the issue of national reconciliation and concord. Over time, imperialists and colonialists invading other countries have employed a policy of divide and conquer. The U.S. administrations plotted to divide the land of eternal Vietnam in order to create the sector of nationalist South Vietnam in opposition to communist North Vietnam. Then they could implement their insidious policy of Vietnamizing the war by using Vietnamese to kill Vietnamese. This created division between and hatred among Vietnamese. Our people can never forget this. During the American War, including the period after the Paris Agreements, our party countered the enemy's divide and rule policy by using the opposite strategy. We drew together all our patriotic, progressive forces and individuals regardless of who they were in order to combine their strengths into a national people's front for widespread struggle. Our policy of reconciliation and concord was a large, expansive policy with the spirit of the party strategy and our people's great unity. 29. This lesson has value today for the struggle of our people as we protect and develop our country. By 1976, the NLF and organizations associated with the armed struggle in the South had completed their historic responsibilities. The Vietnamese Fatherland Front and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam came into being. A number of NLF staff went to work in state offices. Later, the Ho Chi Minh City Fatherland Front and the Central Level Fatherland Front sought participation by people from the political forces previously active in the South and allied with the Saigon administration. These included Nguyen Van Huynh, who refused because of health reasons, and Nguyen Hue Co, a minister of defense for the former Saigon administration. During recent years, the Vietnamese state has had many guidelines and policies. We need even more supportive guidelines to help us address the many deep wounds in our land and among our people. We must fully implement a policy of reconciliation and concord for our people, not the least because we Vietnamese arise from one source and from one homeland, but also because of an even greater meaning. We Vietnamese have one destiny and one future. Every Vietnamese wants to have a Vietnam which is developed, strong, and equal to any other country, a Vietnam worthy of its awe-inspiring history of several thousand years. To implement such a substantial wish, we must mobilize all Vietnamese everywhere. Musician Trinh Song Sun wrote a song, A Mother's Legacy, with lines that rend my heart. 1,000 years of Chinese domination, 100 years of Western occupation, 20 years of civil war. Our people have borne so much pain in order to achieve the peace, independence, reunification, and complete territorial integrity that we have. Today, we will never allow that painful past to reoccur.